depending on 10 the same individuals. There is a dynamic by which the core developers group is being recycled. The same is being observed if we look, please, previous slide. We see here the same thing, but for those who fix bugs, for those who fix problems. The same tendency is at work in this. And the conclusion, based on those two, is that code leadership is distributed across different groups over time, and therefore, there is no need for a code god. Which, of course, as a side note, also means that FreeBSD is not being driven by a clique. It's quite easy to become part of the core developers group. Next slide, I'm going to pass again the presentation on to Ludo.
Try again, see if I can get some more sensible words out of my mouth this time. The one aspect in classical software development that originated back from, I think, the 60s, 70s in IBM, this Brooks Law. They found that when running to a deadline for a commercial project, management thought they could just throw in more manpower and have the problem resolve itself. They failed. What turned out is that as more and more people joined the project, they actually spent more time introducing these new people to the code. They didn't know what to do, and they had more and more overhead, and in the end they got less productive than with a smaller amount of people. To circumvent this problem, the concept of modularity was introduced from a management level. Thus, the whole code base was split up in independent sections where small teams could work on and would not interfere with each other. To analyze this, we trace through all the dependencies of the FreeBSD kernel. If you look at the code base, the small example here is, say you have these 6 files. File A includes a header and makes a function call from file B. B does so from file D. A also depends on C, etc., etc. Now, how to quantify this? This is the particular method of filling a matrix with binary data of which of the two depend on each other. Well, first, everything depends on itself. Then you have the direct dependencies, and tracing them through, because A depends on B, and then B depends on D, so A also depends on D, which goes up to a certain amount of levels. And in the end, you get a full matrix. Then you look at what percentage of the total amount of all the numbers filling in the matrix is a 1, and you end up in this case with 42%, which is an indication of how modular this particular project is. The smaller this number, the more modular it is, because the less internal dependencies it has. Now, if we look at FreeBSD over the years, what's funny to note is that where you would expect, as the code base rises, there is a need for more modularity, you actually see the propagation cost increasing. It's getting less modular and more complex and intertwined. So it's odd how open source development manages to overcome this problem of Brooks' law by not introducing modularity, but using different methods. Which is basically what's written here. Now, to kind of finalize the whole presentation, we see this as an example for a transgression from the classical for-disk production type in commercial software development to something new. And given the increasing importance in information production in contemporary society, this is bound to have political consequences, to analyze these consequences, we look at the nature of open source development. We see, for instance, in the ability to fork a project, there's an implementation of the right of disobedience and different, which oh god, I'm getting into political theory. Which we also see in a lot of radical political theory. And if you look at the nature of open source development, it has a lot of revolutionary potential in a sense. If you look at this quote from our dear Mr. Marx, it pretty much sums up what people are doing in praxis here. And we were also curious what your thoughts on this are. Does open source software have a revolutionary potential, or is it just a bunch of middle-class white male doing a fun thing? Any questions, remarks, things?
This one, yep. Questions?
Yeah, it's a very interesting observation, but one difference here might be that because of the lack of scarcity in the software world, this kind of works here, while it doesn't have any revolutionary potential in like the snail mail physical world.
Yeah, that is true, though if you compare it to political theory 100 years ago, where there was a hegemony of, back then the industrial proletariat to form a critical mass. Nowadays this hegemony is shifting more and more towards bioproduction and information production. And so I think you can conclude that this is the sector where you would form a critical mass in modern day society.
I'm not sure if I understand correctly the structure of FreeBSD. In Linux, as far as I remember, there are core maintainers with full commit rights that are responsible for managing subsystems like disk subsystem, networking subsystem, PCI, and so on. So if there is some kind of new developer that has some fix for the bug and slightly new functionality, and he does not have commit rights to the kernel trunk, he just sends the patch to this core developer and he commits. So are you sure that number of lines and number of commits made by this top 15, top 10 comes from them, or they are just behaving as proxy for large groups of developers without commit rights?
Well, it's a good question. To an extent, we cannot say, because, like you point out, it is very reasonable. It is indeed true that some people send their own code to those core developers, basically to people having the right to commit their own changes to the code base, who themselves incorporate it. So that's true. However, I would expect that not to be so substantial so as to distort the analysis, because if you contribute, if you are a steady contributor, eventually, which is very fast, they're going to ask you to become a committer yourself. To contrast it, to compare it with Linux, I would say that FreeBSD is much more easy in that a committer can check in his code directly without mediating with anybody, without asking for permission. Whereas in Linux, it's more traditional to ask the person who's considered the maintainer or the one responsible for that domain of the code. So I would say it's much more easier for a committer to get his code into the development release, into the current branch of FreeBSD, compared to Linux always. And if indeed there is a dictator resembling